Today we're digging into something pretty fundamental, Gen Z, and their really complex search for what we're calling core authenticity.
Hmm.
So our mission here is to give you a real handle on how this generation is tackling that huge question. Who am I really at my core?
Hmm.
It's a big project for them, you know? And what they're finding seems, well, a lot more resilient than maybe just the polished stuff we see online.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the old ways of defining yourself, your job, how much you earn, where you live, that's almost obsolete for Gen Z. They're shifting away from those external markers, partly because, well, they saw those things fail, right? Financial crises, the kind of toxic side of social media.
Yeah, the curated perfection.
Exactly.
And that brings us to something key we found in the research. They're not just asking, what do I do? They're asking these like deeper, harder questions, often in private. Things like, who am I when nobody's looking? Or what do I actually stand for when everything's so loud? And maybe the big one, how do I stay real when the world kind of pushes inadequacy?
And to figure that out, they seem to have developed, maybe unconsciously, maybe consciously, about 5 main ways they approach building this identity. So this deep dive, we're going to unpack those. But the thread connecting them all, it's this view of identity not as some fixed thing you present, but as a process, something that's always evolving, always active.
Okay, let's unpack that, starting with number 1.
Yeah.
The inner work. This really seems to be about deep introspection. And it signals a pretty major generational shift, doesn't it? Moving away from that pressure of outward perfection towards finding, I guess, inner peace.
Yes, exactly. And one thing that jumps out immediately is how they've normalized mental wellness. Therapy, introspection, just openly talking about mental health. It's standard for them in a way it just wasn't for, say, boomers or even Gen X who often valued, stoicism. They get that if you want to know your core self, you have to be willing to look at the messy parts, the unedited emotional stuff.
Right. And they have actual tools for this. It's not just talk.
Yeah.
The research points to things like journaling, meditation, mindfulness apps. These aren't just like nice to haves. They seem essential for self-exploration. It's kind of ironic using tech design for connection to actually disconnect and look inward.
Yeah.
Mapping their internal state.
And if you pull back and look at the big picture, it actually changes how they define success. Vulnerability isn't seen as weakness. It's almost a prerequisite for strength. Managing your internal world becomes the goal. So core authenticity ends up reflecting that inner peace, your ability to handle your emotions, not necessarily just what you've achieved on the outside.
That makes a lot of sense. So, okay, once you've sort of mapped that inner world, found some peace, the next step seems to be figuring out how that internal map guides your choices out in the world.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the second approach, this big shift from fixed roles to flexible values.
Yes.
They seem really suspicious of traditional labels like student, influencer, employee, maybe because those feel temporary or even misleading.
Absolutely. Those labels don't hold the same weight. Instead, they focus on purpose, on internal conviction. The core of their identity is really built on values. We consistently saw things like empathy, inclusivity, often radical inclusivity, authenticity, sustainability, justice. These aren't just buzzwords they throw around. They seem to be the filters for making life decisions, often choosing conviction even if it means less conventional stability.
Okay, so how does that actually work? I mean, they had this internal test.
Pretty much. The core question isn't, what title do I have, or what did I achieve today based on my role? It's much more like, am I living in line with what I believe? That internal alignment is the metric of success. It replaces needing validation from, your job title or social status.
But wait, isn't stability like a basic human need? How does prioritizing, say, empathy over a traditional career path actually play out? Do the sources talk about a trade-off, or have they found some new way to succeed that maybe we're missing?
That's a really sharp question. And the sources suggest that, yeah, for many, there is a trade-off, or at least a perceived one, but they often see it as a price worth paying for integrity. Like, you might see someone turn down a high-paying job at a company with a bad environmental record, for example. They define themselves not by the fancy job they could have had, but by the one they refused because it clashed with a core value, like sustainability.
Wow, so that kind of principled stand suggests they see self-trust, that personal truth, as a long-term asset, more valuable than a short-term financial gain. That really is a different way of thinking.
A paradigm shift.
Okay, now let's talk about the digital side, because they're the first generation that grew up truly in it. They know the online self isn't the whole picture, which creates this digital paradox, right?
Yeah.
This desire to somehow merge the digital me and the real me.
Right. The goal seems to be congruence. They want to be consistent, not perfectly curated. They
Mm.
know the flawless Instagram feed is mostly performance, and there's a real rejection of that.
So what does consistency look like then?
Well, things like the rise of photo docs,
Yeah.
just batches of unedited everyday pictures, or platforms like Burial, where the whole point is that instant, unfiltered snapshot. They're almost deliberately showing the ugly or the mundane to prove their core self exists consistently online and off. And this push for consistency actually broadens the idea of self in a really interesting way. It moves from just who am I to also asking who are we, which gets into this idea of a collective consciousness. Individuality finding its footing in community.
Okay, but how does that work? How do you stay an individual if your core identity is partly found in a group? Sounds a bit contradictory.
Yeah, it sounds like it, but the sources emphasize the nuance here. It's not seen as either. Individuality and belonging can coexist. Collective consciousness isn't about everyone being the same. It's about shared purpose. Think about big causes. Climate change, equality, social justice, even shared mental health struggles. These form community-driven identities. Your core self brings its unique skills to the group's mission.
Got it. So you're defined partly by your unique contribution to the cause,
Mhm.
but also by the shared belief in the cause. It's a way to have impact beyond just yourself.
Precisely. You find strength in the shared belief and your individual identity and how you uniquely contribute to fighting for it.
Okay, so if your identity is tied up in these values, these causes, whether internal peace or global justice, you need to express that, right? Communicate it. Which leads us to the fourth approach. Creativity as the language of selfhood.
Yeah, this one's straightforward but really important. Identity gets expressed through creation, not just passively consuming things. Art, memes, fashion choices, music, even those super specific online subcultures, they aren't just hobbies, they're tools for self-definition. Sophisticated ones, actually. If you want to know what someone stands for, look at what they create or how they present themselves visually.
Right. This is where all those aesthetic trends start to make more sense than just, fleeting fashion. We've seen cottagecore, dark academia, grunge revival. The research suggests each aesthetic is like a temporary uniform signaling a deeper, more permanent value. Like cottagecore, for instance. On the surface, it's flowy dresses, baking, looks nice. But what's the core value being communicated there?
Well, it's often read as a rejection of, like, hyperspeed industrial complexity. The value is a longing for self-sufficiency, maybe slower living, sustainability, prioritizing simple things over the corporate ladder. The aesthetic becomes a kind of visual statement. Someone adopting it might be signaling, I value slowness, nature, and I'm pushing back against hypercapitalism.
That's a really interesting way to view trends that often get dismissed as just superficial. It's like trying on an identity built on values.
Exactly. Trying it on, testing the boundaries of their evolving self, making sure the outside matches the inner work and the values they hold.
So bringing all five approaches together, the inner work, the values, digital consistency, collective belonging, and creative expression, was the big picture. The realization seems to be that the answer to who am I isn't some fixed statement like I am an accountant who likes indie music.
Right. That kind of definition feels way too static for a generation watching the world change so rapidly. They talk about identity as a journey, self-evolution. The language they use is dynamic, forgiving. I am becoming, I'm learning, I am unlearning, I'm more than just one thing. That flexibility is the strength of their core authenticity. It lets them adapt and grow without losing sight of those core values they established through all that inner work.
That feels like such a key takeaway for you, the listener. If we had to boil down Gen Z's idea of core authenticity from this deep dive, it might sound like,
Yeah.
I'm basically a work in progress, constantly evolving, shaped by what I genuinely care about, not by what others expect me to achieve.
Hmm.
And maybe, connecting back to that digital paradox, I'm figuring out my worth isn't really in the likes or the status, but in that messy, ongoing effort to live aligned with my own truth.
Yeah. And that whole approach is pretty revolutionary because it kind of strips away the need to perform. It throws out the idea of a finished, perfect identity. Instead, it prioritizes that internal alignment, that integrity, sometimes even over traditional stability. It's demanding, for sure, but it builds a self that's maybe more resilient to, external shocks and changing trends.
So we've seen how Gen Z is defining core authenticity, not through external applause, but through consistent self-work, internal values, and that connection to collective causes.
Which brings us to our final thought for you to maybe chew on. If core identity for them involves this process of unlearning, shedding old assumptions, societal pressures, what's one established belief you hold about yourself, maybe tied to an old role or expectation, that you could start to question or maybe even unlearn today? Just something to think about as you navigate your own journey of self definition.